Hello, and welcome to Western Civ. In today's author interview, I sit down with Jason Voiovich, author of, among other things coming out soon, Marketer-in-Chief, How Each President Sold the American Idea. It's available right now. You can get it wherever books are sold. I've got links in the show notes. Of course, you can get it on Amazon, but you can get it just about anywhere else that interests you. It's also, as he mentions, available in an audiobook format. So Jason and I sit down and we talk through some of the initial presidents of the United States. Now we're going a little bit forward here in history, but I know U.S. history is of interest to a lot of my listeners, and so I thought it'd be fun to talk through Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, John Adams, all the way up to Thomas Jefferson. Now I want to stress, and I talk about this a little bit in the interview, that this isn't just another American history book. It's a history book that focuses on how different U.S. presidents developed what we would call the American idea, and then how they had to go about selling that American idea, not only to the people in the United States as the United States steadily grew, but in addition, overseas, especially when you think about somebody like Benjamin Franklin, who maybe wasn't a U.S. president, but maybe should be considered the U.S. president, the first U.S. president that certainly, as we talk about, the French might think so. I really enjoyed sitting down with Jason in our discussion and having an opportunity to have an in-depth talk about some of these people and the way that they interrelate. And I hope you enjoy it as well. Now, of course, as always, if you like this show, you can check out more at westerncivpodcast.com, now on YouTube as a YouTube channel. Got a couple of different video options there for you. If you're interested in some historical tours, got the Alamo up, got historical downtown Phoenix up, more to come, I promise. And if you really like the show, consider becoming a patron. Support us. $2 a month gets you all kinds of bonus content. That's patreon.com/Western Civ Podcast. That link is in the show notes. The website's in the show notes. Where to get Jason Voiovich's book in the show notes. So without further ado, let's get to the interview. So here with Jason Voiovich, Marketer-in-Chief, as I was mentioning just a moment ago. I'm just going to sit down and talk about the beginnings of the United States and how the idea of the United States president as somebody who has to sell this concept, which was very new, of a United States of America. And we're going to start with somebody who was never a president, but I always feel like is maybe the founding grandfather of the United States of America. That's, of course, Benjamin Franklin, who you guys all know is the key and the kite guy, but should be known for a lot more than that. You know, for those who aren't aware, Franklin was one of the first international diplomats for the United States, an important one at that. Had to travel to the court of Louis XVI, who you folks will all remember as the guy who gets caught holding the bag at the end of the day with the French Revolution. But not at this point. At this point, France is still the major adversary to Great Britain, and Great Britain is what the United States is trying to break away from. So let's talk about Franklin a little bit and have a little bit of a conversation about this guy, because he's fascinating. And, I want to think at first about how Benjamin Franklin coming to the court of Louis XVI, to me, is really one of the last meetings between the old world and the new world. We kind of talk about really modern history starting with the French Revolution and American Revolution. So timeline-wise, it really is that meeting. What do you think about that?
It's an interesting way to think about it, Adam. In all the history I've read, I've seen that same kind of break point mentioned often, and I'm struck by how true it is in retrospect, but how difficult it would have been to see at the time. And I think one of the things that makes Franklin so special is that he was clearly one of the only people who saw it that way. If you read diaries from John Adams or Washington, those that survive, or Jefferson, at that time, before the American Revolution, in those kind of early days, those founding fathers and grandfathers and founding mothers and grandmothers really still saw themselves as Europeans just living across the ocean. Very often when you would read early correspondence between John and Abigail Adams, for instance, it was very much the language they used was subjects and the crown, and how they were talking about their rights as English citizens. And it was really people like Benjamin Franklin and just a few others, a handful of others, who really saw that as something deeply new and different. And when Franklin went to the court of King Louis XVI, it was really as an American, something very different, even though it wasn't there was no recognition of the United States of America. Franklin, as most great innovators all do, they believe in it before other people recognize it. And that's what's so fascinating to me about Benjamin Franklin, is that kind of courage to see a world that doesn't yet exist and take action to bring it into being. I'm not sure there's a clearer definition of an innovator.
No, I would agree with you, and obviously I think people know Franklin as an innovator and inventor in a lot of ways, and you have to have that vision to build something new, whether that something new is an industry, a machine, or an entire new nation state. It is worth pointing out, of course, that we have to remember, I think it's incorrectly taught in a lot of schools, that the Lexington and Concord, the first shots are fired, and from that point forward the United States is determined, and everybody in the United States is determined to break away from Great Britain, which just isn't historically accurate. A lot of them still wanted just a seat at the table, representation in Parliament, and so on and so forth. Great Britain wanted them to be the colony. That's colonies were supposed to be economically prosperous, and that was what the idea was. So the idea that this was going to be the United States of America, it starts with a core group of people, as you so rightly mentioned, and then develops from there. But Franklin is trying to fit these ideas in to a system that, an enlightened Europe, an enlightened France might have appreciated in the abstract, but make no mistake about it, Louis XVI was all about sticking King George in the eye with the stick if he could. But this idea of breaking away from the monarchy, that's not something that he would have appreciated. So that's something that Franklin would have had to have sold to an extent?
Yeah, I think when you think about, I like how you brought up the concept of Ben Franklin as a broader innovator, and it's an important note to kind of hang on for just a moment, because that part's important. That this idea of innovation, we tend to confuse that today with innovating an iPhone or some new medical device or a vaccine or whatever the case may be. But really, when we think about innovation's a behavior. It's a set of mindsets and processes that Ben Franklin was kind of that consummate innovator in a number of different domains. And it was that at the core, innovation is about ideas. And it's about the transition of ideas. So when you think about what this kind of sales job Ben Franklin had to make on this idea in the French court, where you're absolutely right, Adam, there is no way that, King Louis wanted a situation where the people in France might get the same idea, because ideas, there's, what is that kind of idea contagion, that kind of theory about how ideas can be contagious and act like viruses all on their own. And there were people in Europe who thought exactly that, and it wouldn't surprise me. I don't have any historical evidence that King Louis saw it that way, but others did, and were very nervous about how those ideas might get transplanted and infect the Brits or the French or other monarchies in Europe. And I think it's when you think about that you rightly brought up, that kind of, boy, what is this different idea you're trying to sell? I'm not sure there's anyone other than Ben Franklin who could have sold it. And there's something about that salesmanship that he exhibited, being able to go into the French court and with force of personality and relationship building and the compellingness of the idea and creating it as something that was different enough from what you saw in Europe to be safe enough for the French court to get excited about. And some specific examples of that. Now, Ben Franklin existed in an era where it took weeks to get across the ocean, so that physical distance helped for sure. That no one in the French court, or very few people, had actually seen the New World. That helps. So they didn't have personal experience. Ben Franklin played into that by the way he spoke French, by kind of a stilted, awkward way he spoke it. And his dress, even the way he showed up, was different. It was outdoorsy. It was this kind of rugged individual kind of, it was like a costume. So when he went to the French court, he wasn't trying to, there's that look, that kind of physical distinction when you saw Ben Franklin look a certain way and all of the French aristocrats looked a different way. It created kind of a psychological distance between what Ben Franklin was talking about and the idea and what the French aristocracy and monarchy meant. It was just a brilliant piece of marketing, frankly, and branding. He branded the United States as something apart and different and had a certain identity, but didn't try to, you could delude yourself, perhaps, if you were French, knowing the history now that we know in hindsight. I think you could delude yourself as a French aristocrat to think that's over there and that idea is going to take root over there because of the unique circumstances. But that idea couldn't come over here. France is different. And I think obviously we know now that those ideas did absolutely move across the pond and infect the mainland, but in a different way. So that key, I think it was just, you really have to think about Ben Franklin through a sales and marketing lens to really understand how he was able to sell that idea without making the French terrified of what that idea meant.
Yeah, and I think it's just brilliant, frankly, in the end, because he has to realize, okay, I'm just not going to be able to fit in. When you talk about the French court of Louis XVI, first of all, you have to remember Louis XVI wasn't supposed to be king. His father died at a very young age, and he ends up getting thrust in this position. He's never been around anybody but other aristocrats. He's only grown up in this extremely heightened French court system with other people of the same class, and class is crucial to understanding why the French aristocracy, why the court of Louis XVI gets so broadsided by the revolution in France, because they can't conceive of it coming. But Franklin understands, I can't go in there, trying to be one of them, because they're never going to accept me as that. So it's almost important to appear as the ultimate other, right, in order to get some sense of buy-in. So it's a brilliant marketing tactic that allows them to sort of look at him as this caricature and say, well, wouldn't it be cute if these guys won? And it's not really something that we have to worry about, because look at this guy with this coonskin hat, and this, no one over here is going to accept this anyway. It doesn't make a difference. We'll have our colonies, still, in what is today Haiti and other places like that in the Caribbean and Louisiana, and it's not going to affect us in the least. It's because we're not doing things in the same way. And it's just a smart way to do it. I just have an enormous amount of respect for him. I'm just curious, do you feel like we should consider Franklin the first American president? Sometimes I feel like we should.
I certainly think we should. The French do. And that's what's interesting about it. When you ask someone in France, who are the presidents of the United States, and you take current occupants or recent occupants out of the picture, most people there make the mistake that Franklin was the U.S. president, was the greatest president we ever had. And, Franklin's image and kind of stake, his reputation in the United States has waxed and waned over time, for sure. But it's interesting to me that in France, he never really lost that. And I think there's that kind of deep respect, even from the, kind of the monarchy side to the revolutionary side, the Napoleonic era to the Republic eras, that his reputation there has been maintained as a high reputation over time. I think part of that as well, not only his ability to sell the American idea, but just him as well. I mean, he was the real deal in so many different ways. And you brought that up earlier, Adam, about how he was a consummate inventor. And the number of inventions, most people know the kite and the kite and the key and kind of the electrical side. If they're wearing bifocals, like many of us need to as we age, they can thank Ben Franklin for that. But all manner of other things, swim fins, flexible catheters, you name it. He had so many different inventions to his name that when being able to demonstrate those, it isn't, people think about marketing as this kind of puffery and fakery and kind of the sizzle, not the steak. What made Ben Franklin so effective as a marketer, and why I feel like he really was the archetypal person in that role as kind of marketer in chief of the United States, is that he was the goods. He was the steak and the sizzle. He delivered on that. He was the real deal. Even though he understood costuming, he understood presentation, he understood media, it wasn't like he was faking it. He really did deliver on those. And I think there's something that is enduring about people who can deliver on that. And I think that's why Franklin remains so popular, especially in France, but in the United States as well. I think there's a real reason for that. Frankly, that's why.
Certainly, I consider him to be one of the seminal early figures of the United States. I think that one of the problems with Ben Franklin and why he, in some parts of the United States, I mean, you go to Philadelphia and, he's everywhere.
Right.
But if you, outside of that region, I don't think he's taught correctly in a lot of cases. When I sit down to teach, when I'm teaching history, when I sit down to teach the American Revolution, it's important to include him. Yeah, you always do point out, I mean, he was significantly older than most of the people who take part in the Revolution. Certainly, I mean, he's got to be 40 years older than Alexander Hamilton, at least.
I think that's right, yeah. He was old when he traveled to France.
Right, which is considerable. But what happens, I think, is he gets lumped into colonial America, the 13 colonies. And, because people say, well, yeah, he went to France, but, so did Jefferson later on, and so on and so forth. And Jefferson gets remembered as the guy who becomes the diplomat to France for whatever reason. I don't know why that is. It's just an incorrect understanding of it, and it's just Washington takes over, and from that point forward, he just gets shuttled into the background, and people tend to forget, the roles that he played, even as we get into the Constitutional Convention and so on and so forth. He needs a new marketer, I guess. He needs somebody to pick up the slack. Maybe your book will help with that. But touching on the book for just a second, I just want to be clear because it is so unique compared to other histories of the United States and other histories of presidents, because you look at it from a different perspective. I read a lot of histories. I read probably 150, 200 books a year. And, at some point, I won't lie, some of them do blend together because, how many books about Alexander the Great can you read? Yes, he fought at Issus and so on and so forth, and was a tremendous general, and probably a severe alcoholic. But we can't. I should say probably he was a severe alcoholic, but at some point it's a wash. We can't find anything new to talk about. But your book's a little bit new. You talk about different types of marketing research, and I just think it'd be nice to hear about that a little bit for a second, just to kind of understand. You talk about the Rogers research and other types early on in the book, and just for the listeners to kind of get an understanding of how this is all couched. It'd be nice if you could spend just at least a couple minutes kind of talking about the idea behind the book and how it's structured a little bit differently.
Yeah, I think that's important for people to understand. I read dozens and dozens of histories, not only for my own research, but primary source docs and all manner of things. And you're right, after a while, there's new nuggets in different books, new things, new takes people, new things people may focus on more than others. But what I've noticed in especially my reading of American history is this kind of focus on eras. And you mentioned that with colonial era, revolutionary era, Civil War, the kind of industrialization and the robber baron era, the World War era, and then kind of post-World War II that starts to bleed into political science. I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with understanding American history in that way. It has its pluses and minuses. I wanted, though, to take a look at it in a different way. And if I were going to think about the president as someone who sold an idea, and that was part of their role, not their entire role, but a key part of their role, I had to look at how do ideas diffuse within a population? How do ideas get sold, and what are the different challenges that leaders face? So the scaffolding I used for kind of rethinking that era of American, the kind of the scope and breadth of American history is using Ev Rogers' research on the diffusion of innovations. And most historians and historical readers won't really know who that is, but you've absolutely heard of the terms. Innovator, early adopter, early majority, laggards. And even if you haven't heard of those terms, you can understand the psychology. If you were one of the first people who got a smartphone, you were probably an innovator or early adopter. If you just got one last year, you're probably a laggard. So you understand this kind of psychology behind how innovations diffuse through a population. In marketing and advertising and product development, this is kind of one of our foundational theories that we build on in our work. And it's just not really been applied to history in that way. So that was the challenge. And what it helped me understand, Adam, was there are different challenges that a Washington, Adams, Jefferson faced than a Carter, Reagan, Bush than they faced. And it's not really, we all know that's kind of one of those historical truisms that we need to be very careful judging the actions of someone in the past by today's standards. However, it's difficult. On what standard would you judge them? And, partly in historic, in kind of that historiography, and I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but very often it's a matter of, okay, well, what was the prevailing wisdom at the time? What were the prevailing attitudes and beliefs at the time? What Ev Rogers' research allows me to do is say, okay, well, there are unique challenges that leaders where there's an innovative new idea, there's a different challenge they face selling their idea than a leader at more of a laggard stage of that idea's evolution. And the most practical example I can think of is it's not really fair to ask how Ronald Reagan would have handled the Louisiana Purchase. The reason it's not fair isn't just that they're separated by a couple of centuries, but that Ronald Reagan faced the sale of an American idea that was largely very, very mature by that point, where Thomas Jefferson in that era was still figuring out exactly what the innovation was. And it's just such a different challenge, and it gave me a lens to understand and kind of put each challenge in a bit more context, in a context that that is appropriate for marketing and sales and advertising, that sort of lens I'm taking on the presidents. I needed a historical scaffold and kind of an idea theoretical foundation that would allow me to look at them in context without kind of slipping into kind of anachronistic thinking on, I'm judging Washington by today's standards or today's kind of advertising thinking, and that just doesn't work. So it provided an interesting way to think about it, and there's an introduction in the book that kind of gives you enough background to understand some of the nuance in there without going too far down that rabbit hole, I think, at least.
Yeah, and I think that you have to think about, because the United States was going to be so unique in world history as it first comes about, the first task of any president is to define what is my vision for the United States and how can I sell this at home principally, and then later on especially abroad. Because the United States is, and I guess still is to a large extent, a nation state that's very self-conscious of its image and what it's supposed to be. And it definitely was in the beginning too. And here's what I mean by that. I mean, you just look at how we conduct ourselves as Americans, foreign policy. I'm not saying everything we've done is right. I'm not saying that, so don't send me a flood of emails. But what I am saying is that compared to other world powers, you look at Rome, for example, Rome would have just said, these people are opposing us, the city is against us, and so now the city isn't there anymore, and everybody's dead or sold into slavery, and that's the end of it. The United States doesn't engage in unrestricted warfare in those same ways. We want to see ourselves as the good guys fighting for justice and liberty and equality and all those things. They wouldn't have cared. Caesar wouldn't have cared about any of that. That wouldn't have mattered in the least to him. It would have been, we take what we want because we're stronger, and that's the way that it goes. And for a long time, that was sort of the prevailing attitude in a lot of things. And Washington, the early presidents, they are still being elected. And yes, people are going to say by a small percentage of the population. And that's true. That is true. But it still would have been a larger percentage of the population than even in Parliament in England at the time. Certainly a vastly larger population than made up the Roman Senate. You can go back to Athens and say, okay, well, their assembly got to vote on everything, but it's a really small geographic area then, in that case. Right. So they're not really comparable at all. This is something that's unique, and so the notion that the presidents have to be sort of conscious of what am I going to do, and what is this idea of the United States going to be, and how am I going to sell that, and then how I'm going to sell that when something really crazy comes along, oh crap, they just cut off the French king's head. So now I have to try to get this to fit in to these foreign ideas. And I think that's a great segue to talk about the first American president, to talk about Washington for a little bit, because the thing about Washington, and you can go back and forth about the guy, is he is the first one. So literally every single thing that he is going to do is going to set the precedent for other people to follow. And he's the only unanimously elected president in American history. He He's got a big monument in Washington, D.C. The capital city's named after him. So he has this sort of otherworldly view, but we can't ignore for a second the very real challenges that he had to face as president coming in. So I don't know. Let's talk. Tell me a little bit about Washington. What did he have to sell? What was his marketing problems as this nation is born?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you correctly highlight that today George Washington is essentially a statue to us. And it has become this kind of mythology figure. And you could maybe fast forward 500 years, would there be even more mythology around this person? Well, when you read, and it's wonderful to read the primary source documents around this era, because when you think about it, when Washington took office, it's just so important to remember there weren't even blank forms to do things. There was no way that you had a government. And like most innovations, there's kind of a big idea and kind of a lot of high-minded language. But when you get to the ground level, how does the government fund itself? Just one of those kind of core kind of operational questions that in many ways is just so fundamental that there's such a disconnect between what's happening in Philadelphia at the time, wherever Congress, met, because there wasn't really an executive mansion yet at that time. But that most people really saw themselves as Virginians or New Englanders rather than, citizens of the United States. And one of the key things that Washington needed to do was find a way to fund the United States, not only to pay off war debt, but as a method, common currency is a way to link people at a very ground level. We talked a lot about Franklin and kind of the big ideas. Washington had to sell the idea at the ground level. What did it mean for the average person to be a citizen of the new United States of America? And really, when you think about, well, what does that mean at a day-to-day level? Well, kind of the Constitution language doesn't really mean a whole lot to people at a day-to-day level. But commerce certainly does. And Washington understood that, especially Alexander Hamilton understood that. In a way, Thomas Jefferson did not, by the way. Hamilton understood that, and he was one of those key drivers, understood that commercial life could unify people. And so one of the key challenges was, what does the currency of the United States look like? There were currencies all over the place in the United States, and most people actually were using pieces of eight, Spanish pesos at that time as kind of the, common currency, kind of lingua franca of commerce was the peso. So essentially, part of Hamilton's genius was not only kind of the financial infrastructure of the United States, which was a little more abstract, but when you think about the quarter, the silver dollar, and some of that first currency, they're essentially knockoff pesos, knockoff pieces of eight, were really about, you wanted to put something in people's hands that had a familiarity to them, but was a little different, right? And when you think about new ideas you will accept, so for instance, you've got these electric cars today. Well, why do electric cars sort of look like, regular gas-powered cars? Heck yeah, they're different, but they're just a little different. They're not so different that you're uncomfortable with it and it prevents you. There's just psychology behind that. And that's really what I try to capture in that chapter in the book, is the importance of the psychology around money and what it meant for people to be able to have a currency they could exchange anywhere in the colonial, now states. They could exchange it anywhere and it would be kind of legal tender anywhere, which just simply wasn't the case. Even though most people didn't travel that far away from where they lived, it was a powerful psychological impact to know that what you were using in Massachusetts was the same currency you were using in Georgia, was an important first step in unifying the everyday person.
Yeah, and I think, a couple of things about that. I mean, first of all, I read the United States Constitution, ladies and gentlemen. Go read it real quick, and especially look at the Supreme Court section. There shall be a Supreme Court. That's about all it says. It's a paragraph in length. It talks a lot about treason after that, but then it doesn't say what it's supposed to do. And the different powers of these different branches of government are kind of laid out in real abstract terms, but it's up to these first presidents and up to these first legislators, and then of course up to John Marshall, who comes in as a Supreme Court justice and says, this is what we do, and that's just kind of all there is to it. I've always wondered what would happen if, even a U.S. president like Joe Biden just says, you know what, it doesn't say that in the Constitution, so I'm not gonna do it. Now certainly Jackson did.
For sure he did, yeah.
He said, you made your decision, you go enforce it. I'm not going to do it. And so it's kind of interesting that nobody remembers that. But getting back to it, it's like, yes, these different states were taxing each other on, goods that were coming in. So interstate commerce becomes the first big test of federalism. That's the term, ladies and gentlemen.
That's right, yeah.
So, so this idea of, okay, well, what's going to take precedent here? So we said all these other powers were relegated to the states, but you can't do that and have a country. We tried it with the Articles of Confederation, and that was a disaster. So the only way that we're going to have a united country is if we have a united financial system. And you're absolutely right that Alexander Hamilton, who everybody knows now, was the one who probably got it more than everybody else did early on. I would agree. Jefferson didn't get it, and his views were just too. He could never come down from that wealthy planter standpoint and understand that, this is not how the vast majority of people lived, Mr. Jefferson. Just so you know, but it's not something that he was able to understand. But certainly, Hamilton got it, and Washington got it enough to go along with it to a large extent. But just looking back at Washington, I think it is important to recognize, how much he then, acted with restraint at times,
right,
and said, okay, because he was seen as almost a god at the time in some people's views, and for him to say, yes, I could go do this, but I'm not going to. I'm going to take a step back. I'm only going to be a 2-term president. You look at his memoirs, and he wanted to go home. He wanted to go back to Mount Vernon, and that was very important to him. But it was also important to him to say, we need to act with restraint. We need to stay out of the wars in Europe. And that's the other problem that some people in the United States have today, is they assume the United States defeats Britain, and in 1783, the Treaty of Paris is signed, and we are right then the most militarily powerful country in the world, and we have been ever since. We were an extremely weak and poor country to begin with, and if you want to call the War of 1812 a draw, okay, that's rosy glasses, but whatever. It's to understand how we were back then is almost impossible for some folks today. But just know that, and just know that Washington acted with a great degree of restraint. I think that's really important in establishing what a president is. Do you think so?
Yeah, I think so. I think the kind of the idea of the United States as an idea and as a government of ideas and laws versus people, I think has guided most presidents and most of them who attained that office. And we can have our debates here and there on certain presidents who saw themselves as in a larger role, but most of them had a bigger vision for what that meant, and that they were sitting in a chair, they weren't the king. And that was such a different thing. It always strikes me, Adam, that that the United States is unique in that regard. And here's what I mean. There are other democracies with other, I don't think Angela Merkel considered herself different than an American president of Germany, they fill a role, but it's different in regard that, to be an American is more of an idea than a geography. And that's what's so different about it. You can be an American in other places of the world, but I will never be a German, even if I moved there. And that's what's different about the United States that I think people forget, because I think it's always kind of the cool kids in class always, we're always the negative kids about where the United States is. And there's a lot to be negative about, for sure. There's a lot of criticism. But I'll tell you that in most other places of the world, you don't get the option to be critical. It's just it's such a unique era. And I think that shapes the role of the president in a way that it doesn't shape other leaders. I think, though, one thing that I reflect on as I read the diaries and reading Washington's memoirs, and much of his correspondence was burned by his wife after he passed away, which was kind of a tragic in some ways. But I think that part of it is the role of those, especially those first presidents, the role of their spouses, their wives, in kind of guiding what that meant and what that role meant as a leader. And I think it's underappreciated. Martha Washington, for sure, to some extent, but especially Abigail Adams and her role in kind of guiding what the Adams presidency would be and what presidents would, what kind of that role of the president. I think when you read the correspondence between John and Abigail Adams, for instance, you get a sense of the day-to-day sort of challenge in crafting that role of the president that you just don't see afterwards. And that kind of active debate is just fascinating to see. And I'm just so grateful as an American, really, to have that kind of body of evidence where you can really see at a day-to-day level what that meant. It just strikes me, Adam, that we underappreciate kind of the interpersonal side of that in crafting what that was, and especially the role of kind of the founding mothers of the United States. What do you think about that?
No, I think completely. I mean, the problem is, the great man view of history dominated for so long.
Right.
And it was so hard to focus on anything other than big politics and big wars predominantly.
Right.
And women, for the longest time, didn't participate in those two areas, at least not in which we could see, and
right.
But when you dig into it, and there is a wonderful correspondence between Abigail Adams and John Adams, who I acknowledge, by the way, John Adams had an impossible task. Who is going to follow George Washington? No one can follow George Washington. There was no way he was going to have the amount of popularity that George Washington did. The Alien and Sedition Acts were probably not the greatest choice in the history of the world if you're trying to make yourself popular, but he's struggling with how to do this. And who does he turn to? Well, he turns to his wife a lot of the time for advice and opinions. And she's got some really good ones. And she's got some really good ideas. And I'm sure their conversations were probably even more detailed than some of the correspondence that exists today. And so we, as with all things in history, we have to remember, especially the further back you go, you are seeing the tip of the iceberg. There's
right.
a lot more there that we don't have, that we have to assume would have been maybe even a little bit more intimate and maybe a little bit more important in understanding things. But I think the role of women in sort of in shaping the early parts of this country is something that we don't pay enough attention to nowadays, because women weren't allowed to vote. Women weren't allowed to run for president. I suppose that wasn't expressly stated, but as a general rule, it was certainly accepted that females were not going to be able to participate, in the government, which means that we lost 50% of our most brilliant minds, which is unfortunate, but that's something that hopefully we can make up for nowadays. But the role of women, I think, is crucial in understanding. It's not just Betsy Ross, sewing the flag. That's great.
Right.
But Abigail Adams, and you could probably give us a couple of good examples here, was really instrumental in how she helped shape John Adams' ideas.
I think I love the examples in the book. It was hard to winnow it down to just a few examples, but my favorite is reading the source documents. And I read the Massachusetts State Constitution, which in many ways is the model for the for the federal Constitution. Not exactly. There's a lot of parallels. And John Adams was tasked with writing it. It's an amazing document in a lot of ways, a precursor to the U.S. Constitution. What was interesting when you read it is there are sections upon sections that have language that is very common at the time. All men, or his rights. And when you read, there's just male-specific pronouns throughout the document, except in one section. And that's the section on the universal right to education that is baked into the Massachusetts State Constitution. And that was something John Adams definitely believed in when you read his correspondence. But Abigail Adams would not let it drop. That was something she felt so passionate about because she never finished her formal education. She understood how critical education was for the citizenry and insisted that it be included. And what was interesting in that section when you read it, it is all about citizens and people. It does not make a distinction on gender pronouns because she intended for it to apply to both men and women, both male and female. Also intended it to be meant for people of Black ancestry and Caribbean ancestry and Asian ancestry. She meant to do that, and not just meant it, not just at an abstract level, but when she helped teach people, in her area, she would ensure that if there were Black children, that they also had education at the same in the same way. So in that era, even though this was using air quotes, a free state of Massachusetts, so there's no slavery any longer in Massachusetts at that time, that's not to say that there wasn't racism and that people felt that all people were equal. That's kind of, again, anachronistic thinking. That's not how people thought at the time, but it's how Abigail Adams thought. And that is so critical to understand, that when we think back to those kind of influences, and when we do that and we see the evidence of that in the primary source documents and in correspondence, we really can start to appreciate that, yes, although women may not have voted, they could, through force of will and force of principle, insert ideas into our legacy that is so underappreciated today. In my view, I wish we could have had the reverse and had Abigail Adams as president and John as the advisor. John was an excellent diplomat, deep thinker, extraordinary speaker. But as a politician, you brought it up correctly that he had to follow George Washington. That's hard. But he was also kind of prickly and difficult, and it was difficult for him to build those relationships. Abigail, on the other hand, was his intellectual equal and much better interpersonally than he was. And you bringing up that we lost 50% of our kind of the brilliant minds, I would argue that, they had to act behind the scenes. It's one of those tragedies of history, really, that we couldn't have leveraged Abigail Adams' brilliance as a political leader at that time, where I think we could have used it.
Yeah, I actually agree with you completely. I think that switching the two of them out would have been the way to go in that scenario. And there's actually a couple of times in American history where I think that would have been the smart decision for us to make. But, because you're right. Adams, he was a brilliant guy. I'm not suggesting he's certainly one of the founding fathers, instrumental in some of the early decisions that are made in the United States of America, but not a politician, not an effective politician in a lot of ways. Just someone who didn't have that ability to work with Congress to accomplish any tasks, and oftentimes, if we're being honest, made him worse. But I want to talk about Jefferson for a little bit here. So Jefferson that's where you get to probably one of the most problematic, at least from modern standpoints, early president and founding fathers, because, he is the all men are created equal on the one hand, but then on the other hand, we have incontrovertible evidence that he was sexually abusive towards his slaves, because we have the descendants of that, and you can't sit there and say that his relationship with Sally Hemings was consensual, because she was
a slave,
owned this piece of property at the time.
Right.
So it's what their relationship was like on a day-to-day basis, I don't know, but certainly I'm not going to give the guy a pass. And his writings are full of him dealing, going back and forth and dealing with the issues of slavery, but and didn't do anything about it, and certainly owned human beings throughout his life. So he's an interesting character to talk about. And honestly, I kind of go back and forth about where do I put him in sort of if I'm going to rank, all 50 presidents, and you'll see it with him, actually. The numbers are wild across the board. Right. And also just because of I mentioned it before, but his inability to sort of see the other side of the coin. I do think he was really naive financially, thinking about the United States of America. So I actually, before we even talk about the Louisiana Purchase, which is, probably what we should give the guy credit for, what do you think was his vision for America? What did he want to market? Because he's so hard to get a handle on sometimes.
Yeah, he is a difficult figure. And I think what's interesting about it, when you think about that as we're in this crucible where the idea is being crystallized for what the United States is in a way that future presidents will not be able. They'll be able to influence the idea, but they won't be able to change it as dramatically as the first few presidents would be able to do. And I think Jefferson's real legacy to me, from kind of an idea perspective, is this idea that there is a difference between our ideals and our actions, and that there's this conflict in the United States. And you see it play out throughout history, and you still see it play out today. The vision of the ideals of what we said in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution, and what we want our country to be, what we hope it will be, the kind of the shining light on the hill, and what it really is today. And that gap, that tension that creates that gap to continually move the United States forward, is something, again, unique in the world. When you examine Chinese history, for instance, and you read their way they look at the world, it's very different in terms of looking back at 3,000 years of history. When you look at European history, it's different. They don't have that same tension between what their ideals and their actions. That's what I think Jefferson's legacy is, that the struggle is real, and that we should be struggling with that at all times. That how do we become better? is, and I think Jefferson struggled with that as well. And you can read it in his letters to John Adams. You can read it in his own correspondence, that he struggled with that himself. I agree with it. He had a very difficult time seeing other points of view, but he absolutely understood that there was a gap between where we want to be and where we are today, and didn't know how to fill it. And I think that's it. When I think about what is one of those defining characteristics of the United States and the American idea, that tension is it. That it's essentially one of the big ones. We even see it today. What is our, how are we reconciling, this ideal of, kind of equal opportunity under the law with how it actually plays out in practice? And, events over the past 2 to 3 years have crystallized that again. And we're not done with that. I don't think we'll ever be done with that. And I think that's his real legacy.
Yeah, and I think that, when I teach American history, I try to couch it in terms of, look, here's the deal. Like, not every part of American history is great. The Trail of Tears leaves a lot to be desired. Our treatment of different immigrants throughout our history has been problematic. Americans have always... It's a land where we're sort of been addicted to cheap labor for a long time, but we don't want the side effects that come along with that. But I do think that the key part of the United States is that, this is a country where we always do try to do a little bit better. We try to move a little bit closer to those ideals as much as we can. And the only way you do that is by looking back and having some form of reflection. And I think that, Jefferson is part of the way that you can start to do that with the United States and say that here's a guy who has really lofty ideals, obviously, and they're laudable. They're great. I don't want to sit here and say, I think it's an immature view of history to say that, well, he owned slaves, so he was a terrible person, and that's the end of the story. Because, what is somebody going to say about you in 250 years? It's the more mature way to analyze history is to look at it from the standpoint of, right, what were the acceptable notions and customs at the time. We can be critical of him for different things. We can. I'm not saying that you can't, but you can't dismiss everything that somebody did simply because they were living within the cultural confines of the moment. And so that's not to dismiss slavery. Slavery was terrible, and that you can't excuse it. I'm not going to sit here and say that we can in any way, shape, or form. And just because they didn't have slavery, by the way, in Massachusetts, doesn't mean that the textile mills weren't benefiting from the cheap labor that was being provided by the American South. They absolutely were, in a lot of different ways. And you can't ignore the way that the economic prosperity of the early to mid 19th century was driven by the fact that you were able to get cotton for nothing. And that's something that we're not going to deal with today because it goes beyond the scope. But it's something that I think it's important to recognize that he was wrestling with it. These were ideas that he was wrestling with. He doesn't dismiss it, and it's as you say, when we're trying to figure out what's going to work with the United States, we're trying to figure out what's not going to work. With these early presidents, it's important to recognize that he was considering it. And one of the things he had to really think about was the Louisiana Purchase. Because there is nothing in the Constitution that says that he has the power as the president to do that. There's absolutely nothing that says that. But he does it anyway, kind of hoping that, it's worth it. It's worth it to roll the dice on it, and I think everybody would say that it was at the time. But he is, and you talk about this idea of beta testing in the book a little bit, and that's kind of what I'm segueing into in an extremely long fashion. But he buys this territory. He doesn't know where it is. Jefferson thinks he's got Texas. He thinks that's part of the deal here, and he's going to tell the Spanish who have it at the time to get out. And of course the whole thing is muddled because Louisiana, Florida, all those territories, they've gone back and forth between England, France, and Spain at various different times. And these are just, to be clear to those of you who are listening at home as well, these are just arbitrary lines that are drawn on the map. It's not like there's hundreds of thousands of French people living in the Louisiana Territory. There are hardly any French people living there, and certainly nobody consulted the Native American groups and let them know, hey, just so you know, you guys are all French. Now you're Spanish. Now you're French again, okay? So just keep these things straight. But he's got to go and explore this territory and find out what's he got. And you do it in this cool way in the book where you kind of talk about the different people who go in this beta testing analogy. So can you talk about that for just a little bit? Because I thought it was one of my favorite parts of the book.
No, it was one of mine too. When most people think about the Louisiana Purchase and then think about the exploration of said Louisiana Purchase, what comes to mind? Of course, it's Ambrose's book and Lewis and Clark and the Expedition. And Undaunted Courage, wonderful book. I've read it several times. What a great epic story, for a number of different ways. And up until I began the research for this book, that's kind of how I saw it. Maybe in a simplistic way that, okay, Thomas Jefferson looked out over the Louisiana Purchase and said, okay, Lewis, Clark, it's up to you. You're going to take this big expedition and you're going to find out what we bought. Which is just amazing in and of itself, is I bought something I didn't really know what I bought, but I'm going to buy it anyway because the opportunity is too good to pass up. What was interesting when you read past, and some of your listeners will know this, that Lewis and Clark weren't the only expedition. In fact, there were multiple expeditions out into that area at about the same time. 3 others in truth, that were all looking at different parts of the Mississippi watershed, the Mississippi-Missouri watershed, which was kind of defined the territory at that time. And what was interesting about that is, as I read that and I started to understand the mindset, I thought, oh, well, that's beta testing. That's exactly what a new company would do. They'd have multiple ideas, and they would test them to make sure that, hey, I don't know which one of these is going to work, but I'm going to make sure that I take multiple bets to make sure one of these teams comes back. I think it is easy to forget today in this era of GPS and down to the meter understanding of where you are in a geography. It's amazing to look at the best maps they had at the time and compare them to the reality of what we know from, geological surveys, what they were. The maps are hysterical. They're really funny to look at because you think, okay, if this is the map I think I'm going into, like, oh, those Rocky Mountains don't look like such a big deal. That's pretty close to the Pacific Ocean. We should be able to get there, no problem. And you just didn't understand the vast kind of empty space that was between the Mississippi River, the Missouri watershed, and the Pacific Ocean, and the challenges there. But I think Jefferson had an idea that he was a very smart person. He was very scientifically inclined, did understand what we didn't know about that, understood that the maps weren't very accurate, and sent out multiple expeditions on multiple different paths with the hope that one of them would come back. It was no guarantee that you'd come back. And that they all did in one way or another. Some were more successful than others. But it was a near-run thing in many cases that the Lewis and Clark expedition may not have ever made it back. And had they not, we probably would have written about one of the other ones. He might have had to send out additional expeditions. But it's just fascinating to think about that. In the book, I think about it. The thing I couldn't help but think about was a board game like Oregon Trail, or that game we played when we were kids. At least I did, on the computer, where you'd travel and it was just so uncertain as you would go, and you'd have multiple expeditions going because the chances of you not making it were very, very good. I didn't make it most of the time on the computer, so I would have made a bad travel companion. But I just think that's something about the American mindset too, that there needs to be this kind of ability to experiment and to, and to not just try one thing. There's this kind of culture of exploration and innovation and trying different things is just kind of also baked into our DNA as part of that idea. And this is a wonderful example of that just on the ground in practice.
Yeah, and I think it's also important. I'm going to give Jefferson a little bit more credit now because I knocked him for a while, but he was very much a product of the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment ideals were using, hypothesis testing, test it, do the experiments, try to figure it out. It's so hard for us to understand today that prior to really that Enlightenment period, that wasn't the way things were done. You theorized in the university, and that was the end of it. And everything was kind of based off theory. But then when those old medieval world concepts start to come away and people say, no, we need to go out and we need to find out what's out there. And Jefferson did say, I want you to find ideally a water route, which there isn't one, all the way across the United States of America. But I also want you to see what plants are there, what animals are there, what rocks are there. Bring these things back if you can. Bring back descriptions and understanding so that we can see what's there. And you're totally right about the maps, by the way. Even in the 1860s, 1863, 1864, when France goes to war against Mexico, they don't have any maps. They don't even know where they're going. They had to borrow maps to see, which way is that? That's 50 years later, and they still don't know what's over there. So it's fascinating, and I think the concept of beta testing in the book is really appropriate for the American spirit and how the early America worked itself out, because it was kind of like, okay, let's see how this goes. That didn't work. Okay, we're going to have a universal bank. We'll see how that goes. Oh, right, that wasn't the greatest idea. And that didn't work for a couple reasons. We'll retool it. We'll try it in this other way. And it's about constantly trying. Like we talked about a minute ago, reflecting, trying different ways to see if we can get a little bit closer to our ideals, to see if we can find something that works better for everyone and gives us that sort of competitive advantage in a way. It's a great way of looking at the United States, and one of the reasons I love the book. But all right, well, I think we're at our time here roughly, but so where, for the listeners, I'll put the link in the show notes, but where should they go to get the book?
Yeah, the book is available on as a paperback, as an ebook, and as an audiobook. I learned to do the narration and got voice coaching so that I could narrate it myself. I thought that was important. Plus, getting someone to narrate 186,000 words, which is what it is, would have been a challenge. So I was the only one, perhaps foolish enough to take that on. You can get that anywhere you buy books. Amazon is the most popular place that people tend to go. You can get it on Amazon or on Audible, which is an Amazon property. But you can also get it at Barnes & Noble or Apple Books or Google Books or at a variety of booksellers and locations around the world as well. Actually, about 20% of all sales to date have been international. Which has been surprising to me in a number of ways. I wasn't so sure about that, but there's been tremendous interest from Europe and Australia and Asia on kind of this American idea. And I think that's what's so compelling about it, is that it isn't the history of a geography or a group of states. Yes, it is the subject is the President of the United States in that role, but it's really the history of the idea. And that's what I think is compelling to people who don't consider themselves American, but might want to have an American mindset. And that's really what this history tracks. And that's so go find it. If you're looking for the link, go to marketerinchief.com. And all the links are there.
And it's just, to stress again, it's not just another American history book. I've read it. I've read a lot of American history books, and you get enough about every president to learn something and to come away satisfied. Whereas this isn't just an enormous biography. I just read a biography of Madison. Very well done. Very well done. And we did that interview a little bit ago. But certainly you're just going to get a lot about Madison, and that's kind of the way that it is. And if that's your boat, then that's fine. But if you want something, I used to love books like this. I still do. I love the big survey histories sometimes, because that's kind of what I grew up reading, when I was, especially in high school and so on and so forth. I love those books, and I thought it was really well done. And are you working on anything else that we should know about?
Yeah, one of the things and I'll be brief. I won't go into too much detail, partly because it's still crystallizing. But one of the eras in American history and the history of the American idea that I didn't really understand was the 1920s, and kind of essentially a lost decade from a kind of big war or big politician kind of perspective. People think about it as the Roaring 20s, and this kind of dismissively look at it as, well, that was kind of the prelude to the Great Depression, and we don't need to pay much attention to that. But what I learned as I dug into it was how transformative that decade really was for the average person. And what I mean by that is, when you think about when did, from our commercial lives, our day-to-day lives of how we live our day-to-day life, there are just example after example after example of how the 1920s transformed that. If you were to take someone from 2020 and bring them back to 1920, they'd figure things out. They'd drive in a car, they'd eat in a restaurant, they'd get a home mortgage, they could go to a department store and buy the latest gadget. They'd kind of get it. They'd pick up a tabloid and read about that. They'd have scare headlines, clickbait. They'd have all of those things in the 1920s. Take the same person from 2020, bring them back to 1880, and they'd have no concept of what was going on. The life would be so foreign to them that it would be unrecognizable to most people. And that's a problem with our history, is we have a lot of trouble understanding what it was like to live up until 1920. But when 1920 hits, and this kind of confluence of innovation, technical innovation, financial innovation, the birth of advertising and marketing at that time, this kind of commercial culture of the United States was born in the 1920s. It's a fascinating era, and the book I'm working on is deep diving into that era and that transformation of American culture from a commercial perspective in the 1920s. I'm so excited to work on it. And it's the more I learn, the more surprised I am. And I think my readers will be too.
Yeah, that era tends to be forgotten largely in American history. I mean, first of all, you get a bunch of bad and or just milquetoast presidents in a row, and then you have the seminal event of you. So you've got World War I on one bracket and Woodrow Wilson, who's an interesting figure, and then you've got FDR and the Great Depression on the other, and then this is sort of middle period. But I totally agree with you when it comes to understanding. When I'm teaching literature, the kids can understand The Great Gatsby. They can
right.
Read it and kind of understand it. Huckleberry Finn? No, not at all. It's a completely different universe. It's so hard to conceive of a world where you don't even know what time it is, half the time.
Right.
And it's a totally different mindset. So from that point onward, you can start to kind of get it, as I say. You can kind of get it. It's actually really hard for me to even understand the ethos and the understanding of World War I. I don't think people today would hear a whistle, get up out of a trench, and just go running into machine gun fire. It's a different mindset.
It is, when you think about that and how that culture transformed the expectation that people had when they would, and how World War II was fought versus how World War I was fought, is a great example of that, where, yes, there were tremendous military innovations during that time, no question about it. yes, military planners learned a ton from World War I, that it was counterproductive to send a whole bunch of your young men into the meat grinder in the same way in the trench warfare. Understood, and there are better military historians who do a job of kind of understanding that transition. But you can't diminish the psychological transition that the American public faced during that time. And not just the Great Depression and how it changed mindset, but what was more transformative was that kind of individualist, kind of ROI focused sort of culture on, hey, I'm going to give you something. What am I going to get in return? That entire ethos is a 1920s invention. And to think about that military planners couldn't just throw young men into the meat grinder in World War II, although that happened in many places. It was never the intent. It was always, I'm reminded of a story in the difference between, and we won't go too far into this, but the difference between Japanese commanders and American commanders in World War II in the Pacific. When a ship was sunk, the Americans would rush to save the crew, to pull the crew out of there, because they knew that their biggest problem wasn't floating new ships, it was new crews. And the Japanese just didn't quite see it in the same way. And, well, why did they see it that way? Well, the sailors wouldn't accept it any other way. That they had that kind of value on, hey, if I'm going to go out here and I'm going to risk my life to be on this boat, the least you can do is make sure that you're trying to come get me if that ship sinks. That is a 1920s and 1930s mindset shift that I think it just isn't talked about enough. And I just can't find, Adam, I've read a number of books on the 1920s, and by and large, they leave a lot to be desired. And I'm hoping that this will add to the kind of the historical record on, give people a new way to look at this and new places to dive in and get interested.
Well, I'll certainly be excited to read it when it comes out.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
I'm fascinated by mindset and world outlook, which is one of my main focuses in the podcast. But the common people are interested to me. But thanks so much for coming on. This was a really fun interview. I'm sure that people have enjoyed it. And again, couldn't recommend the book enough.
Thank you very much, Adam. I really enjoyed it. What a fun conversation.